Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We're super excited about this webinar. We're going to be discussing how we can reimagine travel and help boost the recovery for our industry, and more specifically, how we can do that using guest intelligence data and revenue performance data. We are really fortunate. We have three industry experts here on the panel. Let me do a very brief introduction. We have Antonio Figueiredo, Travel and Hospitality Lead at Salesforce. We have Francis Davidson, co-founder, CEO of Sonder. And we have Vivek Bogaraju, who is the lead for Revenue Performance Solutions at Expedia. So gentlemen, thank you for being here, for making time for this. And thank you all for the listeners for joining us today. We've had a great response to this webinar. At last check, we had just short of 2,500 registrants, which is fantastic. The discussion today is going to be loosely based on an article that was published about a month ago about the convergence of guest intelligence data and revenue performance data. And the link to that article is on the registration page. I'm going to touch on a couple of themes. The discussion itself today is going to be fairly unscripted, and we'll see which direction it goes in. I would encourage you also, please chime in with any questions you have. We might take them during the course of the discussion. We may have some time at the end as well. You can put your name on it if you like. You can make it anonymous if you like. It's up to you. So with that, let's jump in. So we're going to be talking about guest intelligence data and revenue performance data. So let's get, and let me start with Antonio. What are we talking about when we say guest intelligence data?
Sure. Thank you. Great to be here. Thank you all for joining us today. Guest intelligence is about producing insights that builds more effective and seamless empathetic experience. Easy, right? Not quite. Companies are still struggling on creating a comprehensive view of the customer journey. This is typically done by collecting data from all relevant touchpoints, contextualizing this data, analyzing, transforming it with the help of AI to make these data actionable and create a superior customer experience. Once you get that right, it allows hotels to adapt and enhance pre, in, and post experience to meet guest expectation that inspire them to spend more and come back. This will certainly increase conversion rate, loyalty, and retention. The key here is to get this complete 360 view of the guest.
Excellent. Thanks, Antonio. And Vivek, over to you. When we say revenue performance data, what are we talking about?
Yes, if you think about the context of this point of view that you're referring to, that's also in the chat window, by the way. So Antonio and I were thinking about, in context of the current environment, and as we think about travel companies, how do we think about revenue management a little differently, and what's the need of the hour? And so the focus that we came down to was thinking about future-proofing revenue management by thinking about revenue performance. And revenue performance, in a nutshell, is to keep the focus on maximizing demand by over-indexing and also probably leaning more towards future-looking data and macro and market-level insights to power those recommendations in terms of how we think about pricing and forecasting. So it's a shift from looking at historical patterns and contexts to looking at more at future-looking data, mainly keeping the focus on maximizing demand, thereby maximizing revenue and profitability.
Wonderful. Thanks, Vivek. So the worst part of the COVID impact on travel, anyway, seems to be behind us. I say that with my fingers crossed. But we have a long way to go to rebuild this industry. Let me turn this over to Francis. Francis, can you share some thoughts on how do you inspire travelers to get up and go somewhere?
No, thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on. I think no one has a crystal ball when it comes to the speed at which there's going to be recovery in the travel industry. Perhaps the worst is behind us. There's a lot of uncertainty as to what 2021 is going to look like. And I frankly think that there's a little bit of it's worthwhile to be humble when it comes to our capacity to actually motivate people to get on the road, because so many people are just fearful of doing it. and obviously businesses aren't sponsoring business travel. And so there's not a whole lot that can be done, frankly, other than just waiting and potentially participating in the public conversation to ensure that the pandemic abates as quickly as possible so that people feel comfortable traveling. I think ultimately what's going to open the floodgates of travel is going to be a few months with very, very little, if no cases at all. I think studying the cases of China or SARS in 2003 or Australia, New Zealand, there's a little bit of a lag, but largely when the pandemic is under control, the floodgates open. And there's an argument that there's quite a lot of pent-up that could potentially in the second half of 21 and 2022 exceed, at least on the leisure side, the levels that we've seen in 2019. And so in that context, like what can we do to inspire people to do it and to get out? Well, I mean, our view at Sonder is that a contactless experience, one which offers the capacity for people to be in their space and not be bothered and get access to a suite of services, but as much as possible in a digital fashion is really important for folks that will still be a little bit nervous. And, habits have been set. Will be probably more than 12 months since the first lockdowns began, when the bulk of travelers will feel comfortable being on the road and going somewhere else. And there's still going to be, even though pandemic levels are largely abated, there's still going to be some level of anxiety. And I think just allowing people to connect with brands in a digital fashion and then making that obvious at the time of booking and search, I think is going to get a disproportionate share of the travel dollars that are going to come back in. I'm not too much a believer in the our spaces are more sanitized than yours kind of marketing. I think the best possible thing is to say, hey, there's a way for you to stay with us and receive really great service, but without having to interact with any humans at all. And thankfully, we've laid those tracks a few years ago. I mean, it's at the heart of what we do as a business is to digitize the service experience. And so, would really urge other brands, other operators to think about what are ways in which you can totally bypass in-person interactions. Even though there's some guests right now that seem to be kind of cavalier about it, these kinds of early adopters, and I said the more risk takers aren't representative of the entire demographic of travelers right now. And there's certainly a good chunk of the market that will expect extremely high standards of social distancing.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Francis. It sounds like optimism grounded in reality. Appreciate that. I want to narrow this just for a minute from demand generation to demand management or revenue management. In the article that led up to this webinar, there's a discussion. I'm going to turn this over to Vivek. There's a discussion about how traditional revenue management may not work during a pandemic and then immediately after a pandemic, and that as a discipline, we need to revisit things like the value of historical data or projections or alerts. Vivek, can you unpack that for us a little bit? And could you explain to the audience like what works and what doesn't work right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, it's less about terms. We were trying to come up with a term that kind of encapsulates what we are thinking here and what we are actually, quite frankly, we are observing from the communities, from the travel and hospitality communities that are part of the Salesforce and Expedia Group ecosystem. That's what we've been observing. And so as we were putting that point of view together, here's what we see. I mean, if you think about traditional revenue management has a lot to do with using historical data, identifying patterns in it, and using that to help predict and make sense of the future, right? Because of everything that has gone and the scale at which it has gone, and also that the markets are staggering back to recovery in different ways, and they're coming in and going out depending upon how the waves of infections might happen. All of that historical context and those patterns are pretty much borderline useless. They are not that relevant, to be more polite. And so the question is, how do we make decisions? How do we help make sense of what's going to happen? And one of the ways that we are seeing, we are quite frankly doing it, but also what we are seeing our supply partners do is that they're indexing on future-looking insights. And by that, what I mean is not just what last year this time or this week last year or immediate past has done, but how are the metrics and the performance data evolving over time on future states. And we can look at that from two lenses. One is just look at macro demand indicators that would lead to how search is happening and how travel intent might be happening, whether it's geographic or actually stay-based, but also how travel metrics are evolving. I think the evolutionary metrics have become more relevant today because we want to actually spot how things are recovering and kind of be at the forefront of making those decisions to capture that demand. And so one of the ways that we have looked at for us to make sense of it is to look at metrics such as like a market recovery insight. And it will give you an evolutionary metric of how occupancy and ADRs change over time, and how does search drive some of those changes. And so indexing on that helps people get better. And one other thing that we are seeing is that what lodging partners are telling us is that they want to focus on what's now and what's to come in the near term. Look at all the surrounding, look at all the conversations that are happening. Nobody's concerned about what the forecast is going to be 90 days from now or a year from now. It is more about the now, so they can get prepared, the teams can get prepared and be at the front end of how they capture this demand.
Wonderful. Thanks, Vivek. And speaking of what's happening right now, let's talk about the local market and localized demand. Data from many different sources makes it very clear that demand is much more localized now. And it's not just drive markets, although that's a big part of it, but short distance demand. And I'll add, localized in this context also means to me, within national borders. So within national borders and tends to be short distances. And there's an abundance of data that says that. It's overwhelming. Given that, how do we understand that, and more importantly, how do we make use of it to boost this recovery? And let me start with Antonio on that one.
Sure, absolutely. So Dave, we see today hotels trying to attract new guests to their properties, but they are facing challenges of a competitive environment. That's we have today. We've seen this all over the place, right? So there is a need to get more insight into who is planning. What is that inspiration phase when people start searching for the next trip, whether it's a getaway weekend by the beach or extended vacation with the family. So that's opportunity for hotels to connect with them during that phase in a more meaningful way, in a more like experiential way. So there are different approaches we can take here. One is, how can we use technologies to tap into that and convert like this unknown guest or to know and connect with them, or using more like emotional experience with it. So we've seen a good use of, in the first approach, we've seen a good use of data management platforms addressing this type of challenges. This has been a very common approach to address those issues by getting guest attention and converting them. It allows to collect and unify disparate sources of customer data and create a defined guest segment so hotels can offer relevant and dynamic content. Dynamic content is key here. So we've seen hotels to be able to understand the destination the customer are looking for and activate relevant content through the most efficient channel and substantially increase revenue generated compared to campaigns that just regular segmentation with not meaningful behind, with not relevance behind. So actually we saw like 4 times increase in some revenue for some of customers. So another aspect that goes beyond just the basic knowledge about the experience is about embrace emotion that I mentioned earlier. So while this content, special offers appeal to your wallets, to your audience wallet, effective content marketing should speak to the heart, should be closer to the customers. So we've seen studies showing that campaigns that use emotion perform better than those that just take the rational approach. So we've talking about here is one-to-one engagement, as you really know who you're talking to and then know their preference, their behaviors, and why things matter to them. So this is the why factor. This is why it's so important, is people understand why that organization, why the customer is doing what they do and when they do. So the why factor is important here. So when you created your marketing campaign, you really know exactly what to tell, suggest, and when present the message to your customers.
Wonderful. Thanks for that.
Dave, can I jump in here?
Yeah, let me make one quick comment on the drive markets. For the benefit of the audience, the very definition of drive market has expanded. It used to be in industry circles, kind of 250 miles in the U.S. anyway. I just read a recent article about drive markets, and it said you see a lot of California license plates driving through Colorado these days. I just thought I'd point that out. Yes, Vivek, please chime in. Thanks.
Yeah, and added to that definition, we should also think about Europe, where it also includes rail. So there are also rail markets. So where you have good connectivity, we're seeing a good sense of new source markets. But I wanted to talk about this a little bit from a practice standpoint. It's a common understanding that irrespective of who you ask in the business, they'll talk a little bit about source markets. And source markets are traditionally geographies which drive the most demand for you, and whether you look at that demand from volume or profit or what have you, you can choose to change the criteria, but that's how you would actually focus and put your energy behind them. And one of the things, as I look at this and what's happened over the last year and will be for the immediate future, is fundamentally the technology. I think the point that Antonio was making on the data management platforms is a nod towards the underlying technology and the tools that we are using to report on these source markets need to have the flexibility and the agility so that they can flex based on the changing requirements and what we're seeing in the data. But I think it's an interesting question because it is also a very good illustration of how revenue performance and guest intelligence can intersect really well. Because if you think about your source markets fundamentally changing because of a travel restriction or a quarantine law or what have you, suddenly you have to look at where the new demand might come from and then think about what is the willingness to pay and how you position competitively in that market vis-a-vis your competitors. So that's the revenue performance angle. And then you have to dial back and think about how you're going to target those guests and how you're going to target and convert that demand, which is again going back to the guest intelligence kind of world. So when I think about this example, it's a perfect illustration of if you overlap and converge the practices towards a shared goal, you can drive a lot more impact with the limited resources that all of us have during this time so that you can help shape the recovery a bit.
Excellent. It's a very practical example of combining guest intelligence with revenue performance by looking at source markets at the segment level. So excellent. Thanks for that, Vivek. Let me turn to Francis now. There's so much out of our control right now, and yet we're all tasked with stimulating demand. Can you talk a bit about how do you think about that at Sonder, or advice you have more broadly for other industry practitioners?
Yeah, well, I think I can only speak to the strategies we deployed since March, but our bet was extended stay. Our view was that leisure, short-term, and business transient demand would evaporate, and like I mentioned, it's going to take probably another 6-12 months before we see the floodgates of leisure start opening back up. But our view was that stays of 14 days or more are actually where we have an opportunity. If people aren't traveling much, then at least, especially in cities like Sonder operates in urban markets. I know there's definitely some vacation destinations that have done extremely well, but urban markets are down. I think upper upscale hotels, which are our comps, are down 67% in 2020 on a RevPAR basis. And so our view was that we have to find people that live within the metro that are going to look for a place to stay for a variety of reasons. And back actually in March, we worked very fast on this. We actually had landing pages, performance marketing campaigns, sales teams dedicated towards this. By March 17th is when we launched our extended stay efforts. And a bunch of landing pages that would say things like, you don't have a spare bedroom out of which to work from home, like rent a Sonder. You are living with roommates and you don't want to be, in a house with a bunch of them. Well, rent a Sonder. Or you're a traveling nurse. Or, honestly, we tried dozens of these kinds of value propositions. And we cranked up on marketing. At the time, we're probably, folks at Expedia were cranking back the engine. The cost for the CPCs, CPMs went down, and all of a sudden became profitable for us to actually plunk a lot of our acquisition budget towards digital channels and social. And that just dramatically raised the share of our revenue that we generated direct and through performance marketing. So that's, when the world zigs, we thought it would be a good idea to zag and to look for pockets of demand that we'd be particularly well suited to fulfill. The vast majority of our portfolio is, an apartment style offering where you have a living room, where you have a kitchen, where you have a washer dryer on site, which is really suitable for a stay of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. We started also seeing that with transient demand, it's difficult to get people to extend, especially if the majority of them are flying in. But when it comes to extended stay demand and local demand, we actually started building a lot to just try to ping our guests frequently with offers, with the capacity to extend their booking, tap into more discounts the longer they stayed with us. And that actually became a really substantial portion of our revenue, was just extensions of guests that were staying with us. And we just managed to tempt them to stay with us a little bit longer. So the outcome of this is actually for us really surprising. We were operating at mid-70s occupancy throughout the summer. We're now at about 70% occupancy. The RevPARs versus upper upscale urban comps are at a 2.7x factor for us, so 170% outperformance on RevPAR. So we're very, very happy with the results. But that being said, we don't control that much inventory, in the several thousand keys kind of range. And so, these kinds of niche tactics manage to fulfill our demand needs in the short run. I'm not too sure it would be scalable for, a Marriott, although they did, other brands launched, the work from brand X product, which I think is a really good idea, especially in our view. This is something that could be really powerful during the low season. We actually back tested and looked at, hey, had we had this extended stay strategy deployed even in 2019, what would have been the RevPAR outperformance that we would have seen? And we arrived at the conclusion that we could have generated 7% more RevPAR in 2019 had we built those demand channels in the first place. We built distribution engines to post on Zillow and on a bunch of other kinds of channels for our apartment product, even on Craigslist, on you name it. We just basically put our inventory on any place someone might want to find a place to stay or temporary housing. Some of those bets really paid off nicely.
Wonderful. I love it. Thanks for that, Francis. Well, this particular topic on the webinar, demand generation, seems to have struck a nerve, and my feed is blowing up with questions from the audience. So thank you all for sending in questions. Keep them coming. I'm going to pick a couple up right now, if you don't mind. And I have one from Carl. I don't see where Carl is from, but thanks for sending this in, Carl. And I'm going to direct this to Antonio. You had mentioned that the dynamic content is the key to conversion for leisure. Do you feel like that's as important for business travel, or can you comment on business travel there?
Well, a business traveler is it could be also, it's also important. It's to be able to market your location, you'll be able to be relevant in front of the business traveler. It's key. But one of the most important things is also make sure that you understand them. I come to a business trip this week. I go to the same brand, but possibly different property, and they didn't know anything about me. They were still getting asked questions like, "Have you stayed with us before?" So those type of things shows that the brand doesn't understand who you are. So, and those are the most valuable travelers. Those are the most valuable because they always book like in a few days in advance. It's not like long leeway to buy your trip, and so it's relevant to be closer to the to have that information, to be able to create this dynamic content, and really understand where they are in the journey. So if you walk into a property, it would be awesome if you understand the past experience, understand the level of your loyalty tier in the organization, in your brand, and have this comprehensive view of understanding who they are. So you better engage with the business traveler. So you tailor the content, dynamic content on the fly with them.
Great, thanks for that, Antonio. I don't think we'll be able to get to all the questions. Let me hit one more before we move on. We have a hello from Paris, France. I don't see a name, but bonjour. Thank you for joining us. Does anybody on the panel want to talk about driving demand for daycations or day use? There'll be an open question for whoever would like to chime in on that one for the benefit of our listener from Paris, France. That's a challenging question.
Yeah, maybe I can chime in. I mean, we looked at the opportunity. Like, I mean, in 2020, if there's a year you're going to try to look at some really creative ways to generate more revenue, that's it. And our calculus was that the overall kind of effort to reward to risk kind of matrix didn't make much sense. So I mean, culturally, it seems like some parts of the world actually have normalized day use. I think in urban markets in the United States and in Europe, where we mostly work out of, we dismissed it as an idea that was super interesting, but ultimately, if you fully load the cost both to acquire, to service, and the expected revenue you can generate, the kind of profit dollars aren't really there to justify the effort.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Francis, and thanks for taking that one. I'm going to get back to some of these questions in a minute. Let me take a deeper dive into the use of data for the panelists. And it's somewhat of a cliche for every company, virtually every company on planet Earth, to say we're going to collect customer data and we're going to manage it in some sort of a system, a database, data warehouse or something, and we're going to use that data to enhance the customer experience. Most companies talk about that, and to point out the patently obvious, most companies are not very good at this. And I want to start with Antonio on this one. It seems like it's really important. This is a really important topic, and yet most companies aren't good at it. And that suggests, at least to me, that there's some pretty serious impediments to getting good at this. So, Antonio, can you give your thoughts? Like, why aren't we better at this, and why is it so difficult?
Well, Dave, this is hard. This is not something that companies can just, do this thing quickly.
If it was easy, I would have answered it myself. That's
So many of the hospitality systems that we know, we see these all the time, they are complex, lack agility, and flexibility. Everywhere we go, we talk to people, they say, oh, it's so hard to get data out of my PMS system or correlate this data with other systems. They live in a silent environment. So many of those systems are old, expensive, are hard to maintain, and it's still for innovation. So, and many of those leave this organization, this siloed environment. It's common to find customers, service agents turning from one system to another using this swivel chair, right? It's very common. Copy and paste from one screen to another. It's very common. Francis, I'm not saying that this is happening to you, but
it's a very technical term that the way he's used. It's called the swivel chair effect.
Yes, exactly. So it happens a lot. I've seen this a lot. So this poses a big challenge in creating this complete 360 view of the guest, this single source of truth we're talking about here. So some companies fail to build that view to build this gas intelligence, as they don't have comprehensive mechanisms to bring data, like I said, from property management, from revenue management system. How can we glue this information together, or any other relevant systems that we need to bring into their gas profile? So not only system they own, they have this in the enterprise, but any contextual data that can bring from elsewhere, which is very, very relevant. So companies, they really need to unlock enterprise data cross-property. It's not just one property, cross-property. And then make sure that you have a quality data that produce value at the engagement level. So let's see, wouldn't it be nice if to have contact center agents that could have this complete view of the guest, a single pane of glass. So if the guest, let's say if the guest calls about something, or the approach to the brand, to the property, and they would be able to see everything that guest and about that guest and where they are in the journey. So you have this rich dashboard in front of them. So they have the preference information about them, see the recent reservations in different properties. You see the guest had requested, for example, in one of the previous stays, for example, feather pillow. Then I know this I may be able to go ahead and put a feather pillow in the next stay, in the next reservation for this guest. So I'll be able also to see, let's say, what is the loyalty tier of this guest. I see this is a platinum guest, and they have had some hiccups in some previous stays. And using AI, we could assess the sentiment analysis of that guest. You see the sentiment analysis is not positive or neutral or negative, actually negative. And then you see what is the impact of this with the loyalty of that guest. What is the risk of churn of that guest? Would it be nice to have all this information, and then we could tie these with information from revenue performance insights? You can bring all this data to complement the information I know, so I can make a better recommendation. So I can, again, using AI to make a better recommendation, better what is the best next actions for that guest right there on the spot. Wouldn't this be fantastic capability to have? So silos, lack of integration, and lack of comprehensive capability like this could cause big impediments to the business to get things done right and quickly.
Wonderful. Thanks for that, Antonio.
Can I add one thing to this, Dave? Again, from a practice standpoint, one of the things I've observed is that Antonio is spot on in terms of what we need from the data and stuff like that. But if you think about it from a program standpoint, like an initiative standpoint, if it does not have a way to pay for itself, is not driving incremental revenue or meaningfully enriching the guest experience, it's very hard to justify these initiatives internally. And so I think we have to build some of these things from an outcome standpoint that they have to drive a incremental value or revenue internally to the core organization. Then these initiatives become sustainable over a long period of time, and then they continue to thrive. So I think that's just an observation from how you would deploy some of these initiatives.
Great, thanks, Vivek.
Yeah.
Well, we've got several more questions coming in about demand generation. Some of them I want to hold to the end if we have time. Actually, there's an interesting question about meetings and events, and particularly the convention market and how anyone sees that playing out. So I'm gonna hold that to the end and give you a second to think about that for a good answer. Pivoting a little bit from demand generation. So we've got, now let's say we've got somebody showing up. We've got customers showing up at our various properties. I want to turn this over to Francis, if I could. How do you engage with a guest who is at your property? You'd mentioned a few aspects of this earlier, but can you talk a bit more about that? Like how do you engage with guests during their stay?
Yeah, no, of course. Maybe a little bit of background on how our philosophy when it comes to service and how Sonder works. the idea is that we have digitized pretty much every component of customer guest interaction. And so what that means is that we've built a mobile app where when you stay with us, you can request an early check-in or a late checkout, or you can one-tap connect to Wi-Fi, where you can book a parking spot, where you can ask for, tap into any of our services, request issues, message us back and forth. And over time, as we keep building the app and adding features, our aim is to become basically equivalent, if not a better and more modernized version of the service that you get at a full-service luxury boutique hotel. So that's the ambition, and we've done quite a lot already. But one of the main benefits is providing more seamless, frictionless guest experience to the modern traveler. Millennials, Gen Z are going to be over 50% of travelers within just 4 years. That's a tectonic shift in the hospitality industry I don't think has been well understood. And those are people that grew up largely with phones in their pockets. Almost all of them are on Instagram. They spend hours a day on their mobile devices. They're used to and prefer actually tapping into service by sending a message than by speaking to a concierge at a concierge desk. So it's just a more seamless way to access services. You can also, of course, interact with us when you're not on property. You don't require actually having the physical phone over your ear to interact with the services of the property or going down the lobby. So we view it as it's a better experience, but of course there's massive cost reduction opportunities as well by digitizing these and automating a lot of the flow. And so our operating costs and we operate hotels as well. We roughly can do it with about a 50% reduction in operating costs, which is mind-blowing. And without compromising the quality of the guest experience, we often get improvements in guest experience scores, even though we compress the cost structure through the application of technology. But another really interesting thing is that by digitizing every interaction, it gives us over time a really awesome data set. Anytime there's for example, if there's a noise complaint and a guest messages us, we know exactly what time they said there was a noise complaint, how many guests, we can have their full interaction history with us. We don't yet we haven't leveraged machine learning and AI to kind of turn that insight into automated solutions yet. We're basically just at the recording everything and adding more features, part of the large hospitality operating system we're building. But by having every single interaction ever with the guests, that wealth of data is just extraordinary. When you're in a normal hotel and you call the front desk or you speak to someone just quickly as you go out and you ask for a recommendation, that information is gone forever. And it can be really valuable to improve the quality of the guest experience, to get a more complete picture of who that guest is, what they want, how to market to them, generate revenue in the future. So I think it requires really heavy investments over a long duration of time in order to really be able to squeeze the value of all that information to deliver a better guest experience. But in our view, it starts with collecting that information. And also doing little things for example, when you walk into your sauna, which doesn't require any front desk check-in, you basically book the space, you have access to, you get access codes in order to get in. And then once you use that access code for the first time, it triggers a message that we send you saying, hey, welcome to your sauna. Right now it says there's a link to the cleaning checklist that we've used, and it provides an opportunity to really resolve any issue that might arise in a way that guests might not feel comfortable actually reaching out to the front desk to basically say, oh, there's a little something I don't love about this space. And so just kind of pinging guests along the journey, I think is a non-disruptive way to do it. Of course, luxury hotels are going to sometimes have as part of their protocol, they're going to call you half an hour after you've checked in. I find that to be really disruptive and totally anachronistic. Millennials don't want to be called randomly on their phone it's just that thing starts ringing. You're like, what the hell's going on? And then you go and speak to them and they say, is your room okay? And you're just kind of startled by the fact that someone called you on a physical phone in the room. It's just so bizarre. But a little message or a push notification that says hey, is everything A-okay with the smiley face? That's just so different than the interaction model that the hospitality industry is using. But really you're speaking kind of the language that these guests are used to interacting with their friends and even their family.
That's part of the emotional touch we talked earlier.
That's a big realization, I think, of 2020 is that there's a belief within the hospitality industry that you need a face-to-face interaction and a smile in order to offer great hospitality. Our view is that jiffies and emojis and exclamation marks and colloquial text message interactions are actually even better to engage personally with the guest. And actually, this is something that I think the next cohort of travelers is looking for.
And Francis, also the expectation of those audiences, they expect you provide the same level of quality services they have elsewhere. It doesn't matter if it's a hospitality industry, a retail, or it doesn't matter. They expect the same level of experience they have had in the best place elsewhere.
Yeah, and it's not like, I mean, hospitality is behind, right? There's a lot of industries that have modernized their service approach, and hospitality is kind of a little bit old school, and we think that's a big missed opportunity.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Absolutely.
Thank you all for that. We've got a couple of questions coming in about GDPR and data privacy. I'm going to hold those for a second. This is my subtle way of giving the panelists a little bit of time to think about that one, and how do you address that? I want to change gears a little bit. I want to step back, and this is I want to ask Antonio your thoughts on this, and then anyone else is welcome to chime in, of course. If an organization is going to be good at using data to drive decisions, they have to have a culture of data-driven decision making. This is another one. It's much easier said than done. How do you, Antonio? Can you talk a bit like how do you build those habits in an organization? How do you build a data-driven culture in an organization?
Wow, interesting topic, David. So I start thinking. You gotta bring simplicity to the forefront of your organization. So you want to create a data-driven culture. So be it. Have data available. That's one of the key things. This is basic stuff. You gotta have data. How are you gonna create a culture if you don't have data to socialize this data, to show the value of this data to your company? So you must have data, meaningful data. Break the silos among dysfunctional systems. Once you do that, make it accessible in one place. And so you're able to influence changes in the organization, like we mentioned here before. So I've seen this, like Gordon was saying, that companies need to identify and communicate the business value of data to your stakeholders. So another aspect of this is how is, like you mentioned there, is address the cultural change impact of the data-driven approach. You can't just simply tell people to change the culture. You can't. They're not going to change. So you must inspire people to believe that change is necessary. So that's, you need to show the why. You don't say, do this. This is the why you need to do that. So think about this. Here in US, this is a funny story here. So here in US, we have this home. Vivek, I don't know if you have much this in Europe, but here in US we have these home remodeling television shows. It's very popular show here. So why? Viewers like my wife, well, she got me hooked into this too. So get very excited seeing the before and after and the many steps in between. See that? But what makes the show very compelling is the story behind the transformation. So people started thinking, what's going to happen with that ugly kitchen counter, which is all this remodeling thing they're going to do with that tight budgets they have. So we started making those modifications, those transformation in the kitchen, and then you may have surprise. You may break a wall and you find those plumbing pipe issues that we didn't account it in your budget. Same thing with your data. Same thing with when you're doing this transformation in your company. So hotel digital officers or CIOs can use a similar tactics when going through enterprise-wide change. The more that employees understand the why, the more motivated they will be to create their own before and after story. So now that, let's say you started going through this process and say, now I have this reservation data, I have loyalty status, I have the folio data from my systems, I have those insights from the revenue management, what kind of price or kind of rate that I can apply for this segment of people, because I understand the context, what is going on. So when they understand this, when I be able to put all this information together, this culture is, and explain the why you're putting this together.
Apologies. I couldn't hear what.
They understand the why. They understand the why things has to be done. So that's why it's very important. It's not just like I'm gonna make change because of the sake of the change, but we understand why you make those changes, what kind of final product that we're gonna get. It's more engagement of the customer and so on. So another aspect of this is, I think you mentioned a little bit in the question there, is when we handle data, we need to make sure that ethical implications of the data are taken care of. So ethical guidelines should be defined for the use of data and assess privacy risks. Keep in mind, trust is key in everything we do. So privacy, GDPR, ethical use of the data, all those things. As you're going through this culture in the organization, keep that as in your mind as a number one value that you need to take care of.
I like that analogy of home improvement, Antonio. So for anyone listening, if you want to have a data-driven culture, turn on HGTV and play it. It's a really good analogy to paint a picture of what the future could look like to motivate behavior in an organization. That's excellent. Love it. And we're getting a few more questions about data privacy as well. We may not have time to get to them, but I'll do my best. Let me turn it over to Vivek. In the article that was published a month ago, you note that planning cycles are increasing and execution cycles are decreasing. Can you unpack that a little bit for us and just describe what you mean by that?
I think it's the ins and outs of how we are seeing demand patterns and markets behaving, and that influences traveler behavior. You see traveler confidence kind of swing like a pendulum in terms of their willingness to travel, but also their willingness to do something, a kind of activity, whether that's staying or activities, or it's renting a car or going on a cruise or what have you. So we see that across the travel spectrum. I think my take on that was that, if I just build on what Antonio was talking about, is that the opportunity that businesses have that are trying to serve and trying to make decisions using some of this data is also to make sure that you have an equal balance of business judgment and intuition baked in. Mm-hmm. Nobody knows our guests better than we do in terms of if you're at a property or if you're at a brand. And if you're in a travel business, you know who your customer is and who you're trying to serve. And I think it's important that we kind of do a good balance of both business judgment and data so that you can make timely decisions. And part of the thing that I was talking about earlier is, if you think about how we were thinking through about revenue performance, is to say that that agility is also important to think about more just-in-time insights. I mean, the markets are moving so quickly, and the traveler preferences are making a shift so quickly in this time. Time will only tell whether it will stick or not in the longer term, but it's important that we move quickly with what insights we are getting so we can kind of deploy that. So the execution cycle is definitely shorter. We are seeing already like the booking windows shrink, and part of the thing that the industry has done well is remove the constraints around cancellations and giving the flexibility to the travelers so that they can book with confidence. And so as that is happening, people are making more impromptu plans, and they will try to do that as kind of the confidence and the vaccine rollout happens. It'll happen a lot more closer. So it's just natural in our current cycle that we will see that the execution cycles are going to shrink. And I think one other thing I'll just mention is that somehow the analogy that data and data-driven decisions has this thing around perfection. And I just want to caution that it actually is not about perfection, but more about thinking that you want to get better at it every single day. And if you keep that kind of mindset, you would be okay with an imperfect solution going in, but keeping your eyes and ears open so that you can see how the data points are and how this, if you're making an offer or if you're putting a price point, or if you're thinking about how you want to promote the copy that Francis was talking about in terms of trying to attract long-stay guests, trying to make sure that you keep an eye on it and keep tweaking and keep getting better at it every single day, I think we will see that overall progression will be there. It's not to come up with perfect solutions on day one. So I think just those two things, I would just caution that that's what we are doing, and that's what we are seeing our most successful partners do as well.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Vivek. We have a flood of questions coming in. I don't know that we're going to get to them. We're about 10 minutes from the top of the hour. Let me step back, and I want to ask Francis for your thoughts. If we take a really broad perspective and look to the future, what do you think the industry looks like post-COVID? Obviously, you've had tremendous success at Sonder, so you must have some sort of a crystal ball. What do you see as the future of this industry?
Yeah, no, unfortunately, our crystal ball is a little foggy right now, so it's difficult to say. There's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of change happening. But I think one thing I have reasonably high confidence over is the fact that work has changed forever. We've kind of hopped from one equilibrium to another, where now it's okay to work remotely in a variety of instances. So I think that has a couple of practical implications for the hospitality industry. One is you're going to have some people that can just basically be flexible. I myself, over the last 8.5 months, I've been traveling from Sonder to Sonder, actually driving from Sonder to Sonder through 21 states, and I've stayed in over 20 of our markets. It's actually, you can be productive while saying, I'm going to go spend a month in Miami, or I'm going to go spend 2 months in Paris. And employers are going to be more and more comfortable with that. So I think we're going to see this kind of digital nomad, or if not partially, for part of the year, have a few weeks where it's okay to go park yourself in Mexico City and work out of there, and then explore during the long weekends. So I think that's a new segment of demand that's been found, and we're going to have to cater to these kinds of travelers. There's going to be also the realization that some business trips could just be Zoom calls, and so I expect business trips to become a little bit longer term stays, fewer trips but longer trips. Remote workers going back to HQ are doing, like in our case, for our remote workers, what we want to do is every 3 months have an opportunity for folks to get together and spend 2, 3, 4 days, brainstorming and planning the next quarter and just building real strong relationships, so that the following 3 months, when they're just at home in front of their computers, they've built meaningful real life relationships that they can keep nurturing. So I think those are a few of the changes. There's obviously a bunch that's happening on the real estate and supply side. The future of offices and the opportunities that it provides for offices potentially to be converted. I think big convention center hotels are likely to suffer quite a bit, but it's all difficult to predict. And maybe the last comment is that back in for 9/11, the belief in the change that it would have and the impact it would have on business travel was way overstated. So I think there's potentially a cognitive bias at play here, whereby we tend to think that the impact is going to be more dramatic. And there's totally a state of the world where 3, 4, 5 years from now, it's 99% the same. So we'll just urge people to kind of make sure that they're not overreacting to the moment, because human nature, I think, will lead folks to travel in very similar ways than they have in the past.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Francis. So we are bumping up against the top of the hour. It looks like we have about 5 minutes left. We've had wonderful insights from our panel. Thank you all for that. I want to end by asking each of you if you could just describe something that you've learned in the past year, and just sort of a 30-second recap of what you've learned in the past year. And let me start with Antonio, and then I'll go to Vivek, and then Francis, please.
Okay. Sure. What a year. People evolve, organizations evolve, companies evolve, and that evolution has been hugely accelerated in the last 12 months. And you either adapt, you'll be agile, you enable new capabilities, or you don't make it. In 2020, we've seen an intensive level of innovation activities by some companies and others just trying to play catch up. So 3 points I would like to highlight what I've seen is last year. So companies struggling with this lack of flexibility that we mentioned earlier here, and adaptability and the scalability of their systems. People have to immediately march. You saw that moving from work in the office has to move quickly to the home, how they can scale their customer service. So big issues there. So I need to get historical data, a new refresh, a new face for the historical data that, like Vivek mentioned here. And the other point here, companies pivoting to be more empathetic with your guests and regain trust.
Excellent. Thanks, Antonio. 60 seconds on the spot. Vivek, what did you learn?
Yeah, I had a couple of things, and I think Antonio covered one. So the three things that come to mind was, being nimble, being kind, and being intentional. Let me unpack the remaining two. I think we've talked a lot about flexibility and agility. So that's the nimbleness. I think one of the leaders I work with at Expedia Group, she taught us a very important lesson about grace. And I didn't get it the very first time, but I think it's important to give yourself grace this past year, but also as we are starting uncharted waters, but also giving grace to your teams and making sure that it's okay as we navigate the unknowns and figure out the best path forward. So I think the kindness is important. The last thing I would say is to being intentional. Everybody is doing just the expectation across the board is to do more with less. And so I think it's really important that you're being very intentional about what you're doing and where you're putting your energy and where you're driving focus. And I think that's one of the things I've learned is how do we figure out what that North Star is first, and then making sure that we are staying on that as we are navigating and making decisions along the way. So yeah, be nimble, be kind, and be intentional.
Excellent. Thank you, Vivek. Francis, what's something that you've learned in the last year?
Maybe a couple of lessons. The first is a reminder of the lesson from Nassim Taleb, right? The black swan, that we tend to underestimate the probability of a really outlier event occurring. And so even though in the last 100 years, we haven't seen RevPAR fall by more than 18%, this year will be worse than many of the worst years combined. Or rather 2020 was, and 2021 isn't looking too good for the first half of the year at least. So I think that's one piece, one reminder, we need to build more anti-fragile, more robust systems that take into consideration the low likelihood outlier events. But the second thing is that when those outlier events happen, the human spirit is surprisingly creative and capable, and we tend to underestimate the extent to which we'll be able to respond. And I think if you told me, would Sonder and the space, how would have Airbnb performed its IPO if there was a meltdown of travel demand for several months and they burned $1 billion in 12 months? I would have been like, oh my God, the public markets would be puking all over it, and it would be very difficult. But turns out that there's quite a lot of creativity that can be applied, and the brilliance of the human mind could actually be applied to make the worst case outcome or scenario something that can be manageable and oftentimes even presents opportunity on the other side.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I'll add something that I've learned in the last 12 months is that there is an enormous amount of innovative thinking out there, and there's so many great ideas, and there's so many recent innovations, and not just around health and safety, but things like mobility and personalization that not so long ago were just thoughts in somebody's head. Yeah. There are a lot of great ideas out there now today, and I think the job in front of us, for all of us, is work in collaboration with each other and bring those great ideas to life. And if we can do that, I am super optimistic about the future of this industry. We are at the top of the hour. I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists, Antonio, Vivek, Francis. Thank you so much for your insights today. I want to say thank you to eCornell for pulling this off. A great webinar. And thank you all the attendees for joining today, and thank you for submitting questions and your active participation. Thank you all. Hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.